Welcome to the deep dive. It's a question that's always fascinated people. Where did civilization even begin? Like, how did it all start? Today, we're going to tackle that head on, looking at the arguments made in this book called The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality.
This book is a big one. It's by Cheikh, Anta, Diop, and it looks at, the possibility that ancient Egyptian civilization came from Africa, right? So we're going to go through all the different arguments and unpack all that for you in this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a huge debate, historically speaking, and this book kind of lays it all out. We're going to cover who the author thinks the Egyptians were, how this idea of a Negro myth about them developed, the whole thing about history being misinterpreted, and of course the evidence for and against an African origin. Where do we even begin with something this big?
Well, the book kicks off with Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian. He actually traveled to Egypt, and he wrote about the skin color. He said it looked a bit different to him, and he was trying to figure out all the different stories he was hearing, trying to reconcile them. He even described the labyrinth, like the layout and everything. What's interesting is even way back then, people were already trying to interpret things and figure out what it all meant, which is kind of sets the scene for how maybe later on, biases crept in.
Right. Herodotus is like one of our earliest sources on Egypt, but the author, he doesn't just take Herodotus at face value. He looks at some of his reasoning, specifically about why the Nile flooded, and he kind of pokes holes in it.
Yeah, he does. So the book points out that Herodotus thought the sun, pulled up the water vapor, and that's what caused the flooding. And it presents that idea as not so solid. What I find really cool is that the author is willing to question even someone as famous as Herodotus. It shows how we always have to be rethinking history, right?
For sure. And the thing is, Egypt's population wasn't just like one group forever, right? Over time, nomadic groups and all these different empires came in, mixing things up. That's really important context when we're talking about Egyptian identity.
Oh, absolutely. The book goes into how, the Persians, Macedonians, Romans, Arabs, Turks, and then even Europeans, they all conquered Egypt at different points. So that definitely changed the population over time.
And then there's the language. The book mentions this Egyptian word kemet, which means black, right? That seems like a pretty direct piece of evidence about how they saw themselves.
Yeah, it's pretty powerful. Kemet is what they called their land, and it literally translates to the black land. So for the Egyptians, blackness was tied to their identity. That goes against all these attempts to whiten them later on,
Okay, so we have these early accounts from outside, then a critique of those accounts, the understanding that the population mixed over time, and the Egyptians' own name for their land. Now, let's get into this idea of a Negro myth. Where does that even come from, according to the book?
Okay, so the book argues that all those conquests, one after another, they really had a lasting impact. Egypt used to be this leading civilization, but they slowly lost their independence. And the author says that this shift in power allowed newer civilizations around the Mediterranean to grow, and basically they started interpreting Egyptian history through their own lens, right?
So whoever's in charge gets to tell the story. I guess that makes sense. And then how does racism factor into all this?
That's where things get really, really interesting. So as European powers got more involved in colonization and the slave trade, they needed a way to justify what they were doing, right? So these racist theories popped up that basically said Black people were inferior by nature. And the book argues that this led to people deliberately misinterpreting history, trying to separate Black people from big achievements like, Egyptian civilization. It's not just that they got it wrong. The book says they downplayed African contributions on purpose to serve their own interests.
That's so disturbing to think about, how history could be twisted like that to support such horrible ideas. I remember the book talks about this weird contradiction where sometimes they'd acknowledge Black people for being artistic, but at the same time, they saw them as intellectually inferior.
Exactly. You're good at art, but not so smart. It's patronizing. The point is, they were still trying to keep this idea that Europeans were on top. They needed that narrative to keep colonialism and slavery going.
And then there's Volney, who wrote in the late 1700s about the Sphinx. The book even quotes his description.
Yeah, he was a scholar, and he was writing before all these racist ideas about history really took hold. The quote in the book is amazing. He describes the Sphinx's face as bloated, with puffed up eyes, a flat nose, thick lips. He even says it's the true face of the mulatto. This is really important for the author because it shows that early on, people saw these features as clearly African, which goes against all the later attempts to whiten the image of Egyptians.
It's like a snapshot from before things got distorted, If someone like Volney saw it that way, How did we end up with this modern falsification of history, as the book calls it?
That's the million-dollar question. The author thinks that even though people like Volney recognize those features, a lot of historians later on just brushed aside or straight up denied any real Black African influence on Egypt. He says maybe early Egyptologists, the people studying this stuff, were influenced by the racist ideas of the time. They couldn't handle the idea that a great civilization like Egypt could have come from Black people, so they tried to make it white in their minds.
Wow, that's a huge shift over time. Now, what about Champollion, the guy who deciphered hieroglyphics? What did he think about the Egyptians' looks?
Well, when he was working in Egypt, he saw these paintings of them in tombs, and the book mentions that he noticed different skin colors. He even said there were Black populations in ancient Egypt, so even the guy who cracked the code of their writings saw evidence of diversity, including Black people.
That's pretty clear. But there's also this thing about his brother, Champollion Figeac, and a disagreement they had.
Oh yeah, the author brings that up. Apparently, the brother said later on that the Negro race couldn't be the same as the Egyptian race. The book uses this as an example of how, even within the same family, people were pushing back against the idea of Black Egyptians.
This is getting really complicated with all these different interpretations. The book goes on to talk about descriptions of Egyptians from other scholars, too. What does it say about those?
It goes through a bunch of them and then lays out counter-arguments. The big thing is, the author relies on the actual Egyptian monuments themselves. He keeps bringing up the Sphinx and saying that its features aren't Greek or Semitic, but Bantu. And that's actually backed up by, the first scientific study done on it by the French. So for the author, the Sphinx is like this huge piece of evidence that's just there. You can't deny it.
Yeah, physical monument. It's hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
Now, what about all the different skin colors in Egyptian art? Red, yellow, white, black. How does the book explain that?
The author actually talks about this directly. He says, yes, there are different skin tones, but that doesn't change the fact that Egyptians were fundamentally Negro. Maybe those colors represent different social classes, or where in Africa people came from, or even just artistic styles. He's not saying they were all completely separate races like we think of race today. He's talking about a unified Negro identity with variations within it.
That's a really important point about how ancient people saw things differently than we do. The book also mentions Narmer's tablet, which is super old. What does that show?
It shows Narmer, who was a pharaoh, conquering his enemies, and the author interprets the features of those enemies as, being similar to the general population, including what he calls Negroid features. And there are other images in the book, like these Egyptian heads that are labeled as foreigners but described as Negroid, and then a picture of a cook from the 5th dynasty with reddish-brown skin. All of these are used as visual examples to support the author's ideas.
So, the book uses written accounts, physical monuments, and art to build this argument about who the Egyptians were. Now, where did their civilization actually start? The book talks about the debate over whether it was in the Delta region of Lower Egypt. What does the author think about that?
The traditional view is that Egyptian civilization could have started in either Upper Egypt, which is further south, or Lower Egypt, which is where the Delta is. But the book emphasizes the archaeological evidence, which shows that civilization was more developed in Upper Egypt earlier on. They point to these pre-dynastic cultures like the Taisian, Padarian, and Amratian, which existed before things really took off in the Delta. That supports the idea that it started in the south.
So it began further south, not in the Delta.
That's what the book argues. Plus, he brings up the fact that the Delta is humid, so early documents probably wouldn't have survived there as well. That means our understanding might be skewed based on what we happen to have found. We have to think about that bias, what gets preserved and what doesn't.
That's a good point. The book also mentions a tradition that the kings of the north in Lower Egypt were important early on. How did that fit in with the author's argument?
He acknowledges that tradition, but he suggests that it might be reflecting a later political situation, not the very beginning of civilization. For him, the archaeological timeline points pretty strongly to Upper Egypt as the origin.
So it's about looking at the timeline and maybe reinterpreting these later traditions. What about the idea that Egyptian civilization came from Asia? The book tackles that too, right?
Yeah, he argues pretty strongly against that. He points out that there wasn't anything comparable happening in Asia during the Chalcolithic period, which is the time between the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. Basically, the timeline in Asia doesn't match up with the rise of Egyptian civilization.
So there's no evidence of a similar kind of development in Asia that could have led to Egypt.
Right. And he also compares the buildings in Egypt and Mesopotamia. He talks about the Tower of Babel, but then he says the pyramids in Egypt are way more impressive and long-lasting, which shows that these civilizations developed differently.
That's a pretty obvious difference in their technology. The book also brings in this Greek writer, Diodorus, and a Babylonian poem. What do those tell us about the people in the region?
Diodorus wrote centuries after Egypt's peak, but he used older sources. He said that Negroes had lived in Egypt from the very beginning. And then there's this Babylonian poem that mentions Father Enlil, pastor of the blacks, which suggests that other cultures also recognize a black presence in that area.
So we're getting a broader picture now, not just from Egyptian sources. What about the Phoenicians, those ancient sailors? Does the book talk about them?
It does a little bit. It mentions that some sources describe them as Negroes or Negroids, and it also points out some similar cultural practices, hinting at possible connections or shared roots in the ancient world.
It's like the book is piecing together a puzzle, using all these different bits of evidence. Now let's talk about anthropologists and how they've studied the Egyptian race, as the book puts it. What does the author think about their methods?
He's not a fan. He says a lot of anthropological studies try to fit the Egyptians into these rigid racial categories that we use today. And he argues that those categories are based on biases, mostly European biases, and they don't really apply to ancient people. It's like they're using the wrong measuring stick.
So the way they're looking at it is already flawed.
Exactly. The book acknowledges that there were different physical types in Egypt, both before and after the dynasties, and it even cites anthropological studies. But the author's point is that even with those variations, the overall evidence still suggests that Egyptians were fundamentally Negro. It's about the big picture, not cherry-picking specific traits to exclude an African origin.
It's like zooming out to see the whole forest instead of just focusing on a few trees. Okay, let's get to the heart of it. What are the main arguments the book makes for a Negro origin of Egyptian civilization?
There are a few big ones. One is totemism. That's where different social groups have special relationships with certain animals or objects. The book points out that this was common in Egypt and also in a bunch of Black African cultures. And he challenges the idea that totemism is only for primitive societies, suggesting that it actually points to a shared cultural heritage.
Totemism as a cultural link. That's interesting. What else does the book highlight?
Circumcision is another one. The Egyptians practiced it, and so did many people in other parts of Africa. The book says that Semitic people adopted it later on, implying that it might have originated in Africa.
And what about kingship? How is that structured in Egypt, and how does it connect to the argument?
The book compares the idea of a divine king in Egypt to similar traditions in Black Africa. They both believed that the king was sacred, and they had rituals like the Sed festival, where they renewed the pharaoh's power. Image 11 in the book actually shows Pharaoh Ramses II next to a modern Watusi person, and the author points out how similar they look in terms of stature and posture. It's like he's visually connecting those traditions. And then there's image 13, which shows the Sudanese pharaoh Taharka, a real example of an African ruler connected to Egypt.
Those images must be pretty powerful in the book.
Yeah.
And what about the role of women? The book mentions a matriarchal system in Egypt, right?
Yeah, the author talks about evidence that women had a lot of influence in ancient Egypt and that they might have even traced their lineage through their mothers. He contrasts this with Indo-European societies, which were more patriarchal, suggesting another connection to African cultures.
So we've got cultural practices, political structures, social systems, and even art. Image 35 shows a sculpture from Zimbabwe with a falcon and a crocodile, and the book says it echoes Egyptian symbolism. That hints at a really widespread influence lasting for centuries. Now, I know there are arguments against the Negro origin too. Which ones does the book address?
One is the fact that some Egyptian art shows people with reddish-brown skin. Another is that the Egyptians called themselves Kemet, but they didn't have a specific word that we would translate directly as black today. Those are definitely things to think about.
They do seem like strong counterpoints. How does the author respond to them?
He has a few arguments. About the reddish-brown depictions, he says that could be because of the way artists painted things back then, the limitations of their pigments, or maybe it shows a range of skin tones within a population that was mostly black. As for the term Kemet, he emphasizes that it literally means black, even though it's not the same as our modern racial category of black. He's saying that ancient people thought about identity differently than we do, so we can't just impose our ideas on them.
It's like trying to understand them on their own terms, in their own context. So we've gone through all the arguments for and against an African origin of Egyptian civilization. As presented in this book, what's the takeaway? Was it a myth or reality?
Well, the book definitely makes a strong argument against it being a myth. The author brings together tons of evidence from ancient writings, language, the way monuments look, and cultural similarities with Black African societies to say that Africa played a big role in shaping ancient Egypt.
And it's so important for you, our listener, to remember that this is just one perspective in a much bigger conversation. Cheikh Anta Diop's work challenges a lot of traditional ideas and makes us rethink what we know about history.
Totally. This book gives us a new way of looking at ancient history and reminds us to be aware of biases and how they can shape the stories we tell about the past.
So think about all the evidence we've talked about, and consider this. If we accept that Egyptian civilization had strong African roots, how does that change our understanding of how civilizations developed and how connected the ancient world really was? Are there other civilizations out there with hidden links that we haven't discovered yet because we're stuck in old ways of thinking? That's something worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.